about gerunds and infinitives. Gerunds are those ing verbs, like shopping or studying, that act like a noun in a sentence. And infinitives are those verbs with to at the beginning, like to eat or to explore. And they also act like a noun in a sentence. Now, when I say that these words act like nouns in sentences, I mean that these gerunds and infinitives can be the subject of a sentence, or they can be the object of a verb. In this video, we're going to focus on those infinitives and gerunds that are acting like the object of a verb, that come right after a verb. Even though these two forms, these gerunds and infinitives, have similar jobs, they're both verbs acting like nouns in a sentence, we have some pretty strict rules about when and how we can choose between a gerund and an infinitive. And we're going to talk about that now, focusing on when we use a gerund versus an infinitive after particular verbs. So, we're going to look at 4 categories of verbs that choose either a gerund or infinitive to come after them. Those 3 categories we're going to look at are verbs that must have a gerund after them, verbs that must have an infinitive after them, verbs that can have a gerund or infinitive, they can use both or either, and have the same meaning, and verbs that can have either a gerund or infinitive after them, but the meaning changes depending on which one you use. Let's look at some examples. Our first example is, he didn't anticipate arriving early. Anticipate is one of these verbs that if you're choosing a gerund or infinitive to go after it, you have to choose a gerund. Now, there are many other verbs like anticipate that require a gerund, and unfortunately, this is something that we have to memorize, which verbs take gerunds and infinitives. Our next example is of a verb that must have an infinitive after it. He intended to arrive early. Intended is one of those verbs that you need an infinitive after it. When you're choosing between a gerund and infinitive, you have to choose infinitive, to arrive. Our next group is verbs that can use either a gerund or infinitive after them. Like, it started raining last night. It started to rain last night. These 2 sentences are both correct and they both have the same meaning. It means that the rain started last night. So after a verb like started, we can use the gerund raining or the infinitive to rain, and we keep the same meaning. Now, our last group of verbs is probably the most challenging, and those are the verbs where you can use gerund or infinitive, but it changes the meaning. Our example here is the verb stop. Our 2 sentences are, I stopped tying my shoe, and I stopped to tie my shoe. The meaning in the first one, I stopped tying my shoe, means I was in the middle of tying my shoe and then I stopped. I didn't finish. But our second sentence, I stopped to tie my shoe, means I was walking and I stopped because I needed to tie my shoe. And I got down and I tied my shoe. So the sentences are very similar. The only difference is choosing gerund or infinitive, but it totally changes the meaning of the sentence. Now, these are the 4 categories that we think of when we think about verbs followed by gerunds or infinitives. And you need to find a good list of these words that you can study, practice, and memorize. Unfortunately, these categories don't really have a rhyme or reason to which verbs fit into them, and you'll have to study and memorize the important ones for you.